Hello, everyone. This is Carl Zoellner, one of the attorneys with Anderson Business Advisors, and welcome to Coffee with Carl. Today, we're going to do a little bit of a review first because this is going to be part of a little bit longer series of videos that talks about different ways to view your entity structure. For those of you who maybe don't or have some additional questions, sometimes just taking a different perspective can help resolve some of those. But number one, wanted to go ahead and actually start sharing my screen here. And we can go into sort of some basic concepts and go from there. So number one, let's take a look here. When we start looking at how plaintiffs or plaintiff attorneys look at how you own things, quite a few of you, usually before you've come to Anderson or come to one of our tax and asset protection events, are holding on everything basically in your individual names. That includes bank accounts, brokerage accounts, crypto accounts, even things like IRAs and 401, or mostly IRAs, can hold some risk if you hold them in your individual name, because IRAs are actually viewed from a protection standpoint at the state level. Things like 401ks and other things in the 400 level retirement plans are judged on a federal level under the ERISA program or ERISA laws. So federal protections there, so not so much to be concerned about. And that's mostly due to the fact that there's multiple contributors usually in those accounts. So let's take a look, number one, at what your entity structure most likely looks like to you. In this scenario, we've got, looks like, 2 rental properties, one in Arizona, one in Georgia, and then ultimately the LLC you see at the top there listed as any, LLC. That's probably a flip in some other state. And then you see a Texas corporation on the next level down. That is most likely because the couple live in Texas, and you can tell that as well because their living trust and basically all the ancillary documents for that living trust are drafted for Texas. So that's why we label the state. And so when you say when we talk about your wealth planning blueprint or your entity structure, this visual depiction is what you see. It looks a little bit different in the Platinum portal just because ultimately the drafting software is a little bit different. This is just a PowerPoint presentation, so not quite as sophisticated as the other Lucidchart software. So ultimately what we look at here is this is what you see, but let's see what other people will see if there's a issue in there. So in this scenario, this is called inside liability issue. So this is basically if somebody got hurt on that Arizona property. Scenario in my mind when I built this was basically there was an Arizona property that's done as an Airbnb and somebody gets, slip falls and gets hurt. Maybe there's a pool or something on the property. So in this scenario, that Arizona LLC and ultimately, the property in Arizona is held in a land trust. So titled ownership, land trust, beneficial interest in that land trust, Arizona LLC. So if somebody's coming after that property, they're trying to take it away from that Arizona LLC. And then ultimately, that Arizona LLC is owned by that Wyoming holding company. So if I sort of flash back a picture, you'll see the boxes are in the same place. But this is what the potential that the potential plaintiff for a lawsuit against that Arizona property can see. You notice you can't see anything on the other side of that Wyoming holding company. So that Georgia, the Texas corporation, or that entity owned by the Texas corporation isn't visible due to basically that Wyoming LLC and the anonymity side of what that Wyoming LLC provides. So basically, the idea is we set up entities to separate the liability as well as the anonymity in a scenario. It's not the pot of gold gets much smaller. So if we go back to that picture, and the pot of gold sits in the Wyoming in this scenario, and then ultimately we look at like I said, the anonymity pieces are what create sort of the separation. But this is a scenario, say, where somebody's trying to sue because they got hurt on a rental property. And so ultimately, the other good news here is, like I said, the anonymity is a sort of a deterrent at the first level. If somebody even discovers the Wyoming entity, if they're not deterred by the anonymity piece of it, ultimately, if they see that Wyoming entity, I've got colleagues I went to law school with that say they won't even attempt to take something from a Wyoming or a Nevada because it's too expensive to do it. So that's sort of if you look at the anonymity as the bark, the actual entities themselves are the bite. And from a Wyoming LLC standpoint, they don't really bite much harder than that because of the charging order protections you learned about in Wyoming through some of our other educational courses and YouTube videos as well. So remember, this is what you can see. If for some reason something happened on that Arizona property, that's the basic extent of what they could see before there's some sort of lawsuit filed. So it probably doesn't look super appealing to them anyways, especially if we start to consider that a lot of these investment properties are usually pretty highly leveraged. And so the equities a lot of time isn't even really be there for an attorney to find it super attractive. But you add those other properties and corporation in, starts to look a little bit more like some more digging should happen. In this scenario, it's sort of like, oh, let's move on to the next one. Okay, so remember, this is what you can see, but that's not what any potential plaintiff can see. So let's go from the one we talked about here with the rental property, we would term that as inside liability because it's something that actually happened on one of the properties that was already basically boxed in by a local state LLC. Let's look at what happens if, say, some Yahoo runs a stoplight and then says it's your fault that they hit you. In that scenario, basically what you see here is what they would see. They would just see the individuals because, once again, that Wyoming entity provides the anonymity for anything it owns. And in this scenario, it owns that Georgia LLC, Texas corporation, which the Texas corporation then owns that any state LLC. And then that Wyoming also owns Arizona. So yeah, if they could see all those, that's certainly more appealing than sort of just seeing the individuals. But the benefit of just seeing the individuals is basically that tells them they better settle for insurance limits or they may get nothing at all, especially since this couple in this scenario is, as I mentioned in the beginning, from Texas. So their personal residence is not available to any sort of judgment, whether there's $10 in equity or $10 million. So something to, like I said, for a little extra information there. But ultimately in this scenario, like I said, basically, if somebody's trying to come after you, even if you don't live in Texas, if you do have this entity structure set up this way, you would still have the anonymity. So it still just looks like insurance is the best policy for an outside liability issue, like a car accident. God forbid, hope it doesn't happen to anyone. But if it does, at least you'd be protected. Your assets would be protected under that previous scenario like this. And like I said, basically the only thing they see is this piece of it. They don't even see your living trust. So ultimately, yeah, they would see insurance limits. And then, that usually ends up being enough to settle at some point and moving on. So, okay. So let's see this. Remember, this is what you can see. So that's why I kind of keep flashing back and forth. So you have the ability to say, okay, so I know I've got all this. And then what does it look like? I guess the third thing to look at is what does it look like to the IRS? Because each of these entities does not have a tax return. We tend to set them up as what's referred to as disregarded. So basically it says this Arizona LLC, this Georgia LLC, it's all flowing down to the individuals. So when we say, what does the IRS see, or where do you have tax returns due? The corporation, whether it's a C or an S corporation, does file its own return, and which is a good thing in this scenario because that's a huge tax planning vehicle between individual and corporate taxation. So that's a huge tax benefit to actually have one of these. I would encourage you to also look up family management company. Toby's got a couple great videos out there on some of the different tax benefits you could be taking by having that family management company. And I'm going to do a video here as part of this series about that as well. And then let's see, what do we got? So yeah, like I said, taxes are going to be huge in this scenario because as individuals, we get to earn, we get taxed on what we earn, and then the government's nice enough to let us spend what's left over. And I say nice enough. And then from the corporate standpoint, though, you earn, you spend, and then get taxed on what's left over. So that slight difference on where the tax happens is where a lot of the tax planning occurs. So yeah, that's one thing too. But yeah, the IRS sees corporate tax return, and then the individual is basically it. And then you can see all the other entities are currently not filing that. The one sort of X factor is when you have your consults with one of our strategists or attorneys, they will go through if that Wyoming entity should be done as a disregarded entity, so one that doesn't have to do its own tax returns, or a partnership, because sometimes changing that slightly can create a better overall scenario for you. But it's certainly a one-off basis or something that needs to be analyzed by one of our strategists or attorneys to be able to say, hey, you get some benefit out of having that, Wyoming LLC that's listed as the holding company there in the middle as a partnership under X, Y, and Z scenario. And then ultimately, otherwise we can look at doing it as so in this scenario, we would have the option, because technically Texas is a community property state. So it could be taxed as either. In this scenario, just given what I see, I would probably have it as a disregarded entity until there's probably at least 2 or 3 more rental properties on there. Then it can make more sense as a partnership. So just something to be aware of there. Like I said, it'll be individually analyzed for you during any consultation you have. And then the strategist or attorney, as I mentioned, will give you their suggestion, and then you can make the decision from there. So that's good to note as well. Once again, this is what you see. This is not what everybody sees. And then, like I said, the IRS just sees the corporation because it's its own taxpayer, and then the individuals here because all the rental income is still flowing down ultimately onto the Schedule E of the 1040. All right. So that's our initial review. My suggestion would be is before you review any of the other videos on different perspectives on the structure, that you kind of take a look at this one again, because it was just a quick refresher on what you're looking at from that perspective. But yeah, ultimately, like I said, remember, this is what you see always. This is what somebody, like I said, if a car accident scenario happens, this is what some outside plaintiff's attorney or plaintiff can see. So basically you just as individuals. And then ultimately as well, remember, if there's some issue on one of your properties, this is the extent of what they can see. And that Wyoming LLC might as well be owned by somebody else, because Wyoming's charging order protections are the best in the nation. As well as I mentioned, it provides a level of anonymity, and maintenance cost is also a great reason to use Wyoming. So let's see here. And then, yeah, remember, that's what you see. That's what, from an inside liability, that's what somebody would see. So like I said, if somebody got injured on one of those properties, once again, what you see, what an outside liability issue would look like. So they would only see you as individuals. And like I said, that basically forces them a lot of times into settling for insurance limits, because if they can't see what else you own, you take that pot of gold out from the end of the rainbow, and then ultimately the whole thing just kind of becomes speculative, and attorneys have to pay to keep the lights on as well. So you'd be more likely to go after sort of the bird in the hand versus the potential two in the bush, as the proverb goes. So, and then, yeah, like I said, the IRS is the only other piece of that. And then, like I said, the tax vehicle that's done as that corporation is usually far more valuable than the return that is done. So ultimately, that's actually a benefit once you have that in your overall entity structure. And then, like I mentioned, I would just say, look, if you're interested in that family management company, which that could be as well, that's one of those things that there's lots of different online content that I know Toby and Clint have created content on. And like I said, one of the future Coffee with Carl episodes will address that as well. So as always, if you have not yet already, please like, subscribe, and share with a friend. And that goes for all the Anderson YouTube channels. So if you can do that, that would be awesome. And it basically keeps telling us that creating this free content is valuable to you. If you're not already a client, please reach out for a free consultation. There's usually links to all the stuff that I mentioned in the video when we post it, sort of where you would normally click the different links to things. And I would encourage you, if you haven't been to one of our tax and asset protection online classes recently, to join us. We tend to update the material as relevant updates happen. And of course, during this presidential transition, there has been some changes. So it's always good to sort of hit those classes as refreshers. And then there's also live attorney help on those classes in the Q&A section, which I think is an incredible benefit. And I tend to be there quite a bit too. So you see Carl respond to your question. That's me. And then, so yeah, thanks once again for joining me. Like I said, if you're going to go deeper into this video series on this piece, I would review this video before we start going into the different perspectives or different ways to view that entity structure, just so you have the initial primer and then you get the additional pieces where the visuals, you can sort of follow the visuals probably a little better. So that's just a suggestion, though. Once again, just to remind everybody, like, subscribe, share, and that tells us to keep making the material for your unpaid free consumption. And then hopefully, we catch you at either an in-person or an online event sooner rather than later as well. So thanks again. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Coffee with Carl, and we'll catch you on the next one.